Tasúlagam go bhfuil sibh go léir ar maidin and GOMEX. So how are you all this morning? It's very odd for me to be sitting talking to a screen with my face on it in front of a beach in Donegal, especially when I'm not at the beach in Donegal. So normally I run any of my talks or seminars on the basis of the questions that people have for me, because the subject of trauma is so wide. I'll be talking at midnight, and you will have long since deserted the beach in Donegal. And my father said I could talk for Ireland anyway, which is probably true, but it'll be difficult, I think, without questions. So I would appreciate it if people do have questions, that they put them up, and it'll give me guidance as to the kind of things you want to hear about or want to talk about for the next 45 minutes. So if you would like to just put on chat at the minute what you think you might be interested in, that you might be interested in learning about, or getting some more information or advice or whatever, if you could let me know, it would help. So I'm going to share my screen with you. If I can get it to share, yes. Here we go. So what I'd like to start with is some of the questions that I normally get asked about trauma. So what it actually is, what happens in the aftermath of traumatic events, what are the actual impacts of trauma and how do they continue, and how can you help yourself and others in the aftermath of trauma. So these are the questions that I hope will guide my talk with you all this morning. And I want to start off a bit controversially, because I want to start off with some myths about trauma. I don't know, but down in the south, but in the north, the word trauma has been very undervalued. It is often used about everything, which leaves it having no value whatsoever, and also carries a kind of cynical response when the word is used. So I want to make sure today that when we're talking about trauma, we know what we're actually talking about, and not the popular understanding of trauma. So I want to go through just a couple of myths to start with, and maybe some of you would like to make some comments. So the first thing I would say to you, that trauma is not a mental health condition. It is not a mental illness. And often the word trauma is used synonymously with meaning mental health issues. Now, that's not to say that mental health concerns can't emerge out of traumatic situations. And if the traumatic experience is left unintegrated and unattended, there's a strong possibility that some form of mental health concern may emerge. But of itself, trauma is not a mental health condition. So the second thing I'd say is that neither is trauma a disorder. The word disorder implies something medical, something that has to be borne, something that has to be medicated, and something that is probably long-lasting with no definite resolution. Trauma is not a disorder. Trauma is an injury. Peter Levine talks about trauma as an injury when he wants people to understand that trauma is a state that you can recover from. trauma can be integrated, and often where there's been, say for example, a broken leg or a broken arm, the bone is often stronger where the break is. And what he's trying to say is that often the capacity of people to withstand overwhelming events of life or distressing events of life are often strengthened when the impacts of trauma have been integrated. So trauma is not a life sentence. It is not a life sentence. But trauma can last for a long time. You can recover from it, but people can carry the impacts of trauma for the whole of their lives. And I remember once talking to one of the elected reps up in Stormont here about this, and he was quite aghast and said, "Do you mean that I could still be suffering from the impact of trauma earlier in my life?" And I said, "Yes, you could. I'm not saying you are, but certainly, yes, you could." And so there's two things I'd want to say about that. One is that the impacts of trauma are not problems until they're experienced as problems. In my experience as a psychotherapist of 30 years, what I'm aware of is that when people's survival strategies aren't working anymore, that's when they come into a therapy to support their experiences of trauma. But it's only when they begin to understand it as a problem do they get as far as my room. And the second thing that I would say to you is amazing creativity often emerges from trauma energy. So we have poets and dancers and writers, we have photographers, we have political organizers, we have volunteers in community groups, we have all sorts of ways in which people move forward to try and manage what is happening in their systems as a result of trauma. And at a social level, of course, they're great things. And the person may be suffering, but that may be how they're channeling their energy. And so I will certainly look at that more. And you can see how self-help groups would emerge on the back of that. It's not limited to the individual experience. Trauma is not just an individual experience. We live in groups. We are genetically predisposed to living in groups. It is in our DNA to depend on each other for safety, for comfort, for acknowledgement, all of those things. And in trauma terms, we refer to that as co-regulation. It is built in our system that we find co-regulation with others. So if I am injured, other people can pick up on my injury at a nervous system level. You just have to look, for example, in a nursery, even before children have language, and one child starts to cry. All of the babies will be crying in a very short space of time. And that's because their nervous systems connect with the distress of the one in the group who is distressed. You can see it in when people are working in groups, when some people start to maybe get very upset or get distressed about things. Some people get irritated and try to block it out, and other people find themselves getting caught up in it. This is not a response in the neocortex. This is a nervous system response, and I'll talk about that later on. It touches the communities that we live in. So you know the phrase, an injury to one is an injury to all. At the level of our nervous system, this is true. I was reading an article the other day about the birth of civilization. by an anthropologist who was asked when civilization began, when people began to become human. And she said when they discovered a thigh bone that had been broken and had knitted together again, they realized that that was the beginning of people taking care of each other. So if the thigh bone had been broken at previous times, the person may have just been simply left because they were no longer useful to the group. But at the moment at which you could find ancient bones, where, in archaeological terms, ancient, where the bone had knitted, it meant that someone had nurtured the experience. And the last line of the article was, it is not survival of the fittest, it's survival of the nurturers, when we nurture each other. We know now that in a transgenerational sense, children can orientate to the traumatic experiences of their parents. And I can talk about that later on if anyone is interested in that. But if a child is born into a situation where there is great fear in the situation, the child's brain will begin to orientate and develop the neurological pathways in relation to the danger, because the child has to rely on the caregiver's nervous system to learn how to develop a nervous system. And if the carer is frightened, or if there's fear in the community, then the child will orientate in that direction. And that is not a life sentence. And the final thing I would say in the myth busting sequence is it doesn't matter how often you tell the story, it will have very little impact on traumatic memory. Very little. We come from traditions of storytelling. We are great storytellers in Ireland. And storytelling is part of how we connect with each other. Like, for example, I was reared with millions of stories about my family, and like with my mother's family going back to something like 1726. You know, my father's family, not so much, sort of back to about 1840. But, you know, we've had lots and lots and lots of stories about the family told, and it's a way of life. But that does not integrate trauma. Trauma is felt initially and experienced initially. It's first of all as an embodied experience. But what this means is that the system in the body that is inbuilt in our DNA to detect danger is online when we are born. So we are in our nervous systems from day one. We can sense danger. We have a fully formed danger signal in our systems. It's only afterwards, through our connection with other human beings, that we learn language, that we learn how to communicate, that we learn how to share experiences, we learn how to socially engage. The cortex is predominant in what we call recall as a way of thinking about memory. And so recall is a language-based experience. When I'm in a traumatic experience that is threatening my life, I'm not considering through my cortex the nuts and bolts of that experience. I'm trying to save my life. It is an instinctive response. It isn't a thought out choice. Whether I run away or stay and fight is not a choice, and it certainly isn't a moral choice. It is simply an instinct that arises out of the structure of our self-preservation system. It is only afterwards that the neocortex allows us to pick out the bits of that experience that we hold in our recall. So Daniel Siegel, in I think it was his first book on Developing Mind, he talks about the difference between what he calls implicit and explicit memory. Explicit memory is what we refer to as recall. It's a language-based memory. We can talk about it. Implicit memory is the memory that we experience through our nervous system and comes before the operation of the cortex. So, everyone in the world, regardless of who it is, when there is an overwhelming event in your life, will suffer the same physiology of trauma. What happens in the physiology to our system, to our bodies, to the way we experience that? We will all do it the same way because we all have the same DNA. But how you enact what happens to you is dependent on your unique personal history in combination with the family style and cultural context. So how we act out as a result of trauma is dependent on our cultural context, what is the rights and wrongs of our family style, the things that we do or don't do as a result of our family style, and our unique personal history. So from culture to culture, how we express the impacts of trauma will differ. For example, in the North, and I'm sure it is true also in the South, we have a high rate of suicide. Now, when I was growing up, the cultural statements about suicide made it an unthinkable option. Whether or not it happened, and I'm sure it did, but whether or not it happened to the level that it's happening now, well, I wouldn't necessarily think that was the case, but it was an unthinkable option. It wasn't in the system of considering it, or even holding it as a way out when things became unbearable in your life. And there has been a cultural change. That's not the case now. That is not the case now. So we can think of lots of different ways in which culture has changed what becomes possible for us to change in relation to how we live out our traumatic experiences. I'm just going to have a quick look here. Yes. Okay, thank you. I've been asked 2 questions and I will address both of them. Well, I'm addressing the first one. If you have a look at your chat, I think you'll see what is trauma. And the second one is the distressing, haunting experiences of events over time. And how can you help yourself? Okay. So, trauma, just get that out of the way. Trauma is an internal straitjacket. It's like your whole system at the moment when a traumatic experience happens, you get frozen in time. Now, you aren't frozen. On the surface, you clearly are not frozen, but it's like someone presses the pause button in your nervous system. And the result of it is that it has a huge impact on your ability to live fully in your life. And it disconnects us, and we are overwhelmed, and so we have that frozen in fear experience. But we also have instinctive survival energies, and those energies have nowhere to go. So, put in another way, when the terrible event of trauma occurs, there is a fight instinctive response, a flight instinctive response, and a freeze dissociation instinctive response. The first and most devastating impact of trauma is that we lose connection. It's like we are pushed out of the society of people that we have known all our lives. We feel like we'll never be the same again. Years ago, there was a young fella that came to me for trauma support. And at the end of the experience, and I was asking him to review his therapy with me, he said, and I did say to him, can I quote you on this? He said to me, I don't feel like a ghost in my own life anymore. I knew that I could see people, but I didn't know that they could see me. I knew I had survived, but I didn't know that I was alive. And this is quite right. This is the experience of trauma. You are set aside from everything that you know. And given that our search always as human beings starts with co-regulation, then the isolation of trauma, the isolation of trauma impact is very, very difficult for people to bear. So they have to develop ways of behaving. So in the somatic experience of trauma, which is the approach that I use, I work with the nervous system, because trauma is held in your nervous system. It's held in the data. It's held in how your autonomic nervous system has held the event. It's not in the story of the event. That's not where it is. Although people do tell the story again and again and again and again and again, thinking that somehow that will shift the system. I can't count the number of clients who've come into me in my lifetime saying, I've told this story 1,000 times and nothing changes. So sorry, I've lost my pointer there. So we experience the felt sense. We experience the world through our felt sense. And the felt sense is like this overall feeling that you know something. You know it in every aspect of your being. And you can often hear people saying, you know, I know that in my head, but I don't seem to know it anywhere else. So the felt sense is trying to see or trying to experience, how am I knowing that? What is happening in my body that I'm knowing that? Now, I had hoped that I would be able to see you all and to do some work with you all, and that doesn't seem to be the situation this morning. So I'm going to have to just talk about this. If you, no, I think I'll ask you to do this anyway. If you close your eyes and you bring to mind something, some event at some time in your life that was a happy event or a good event or a pleasant event, or at least neutral. at least not desperate. Just pay attention to what happens in your body. You might, for example, notice that you suddenly feel warm. You might notice that you let out a long breath. You might notice a kind of buzzy feeling. You might notice like you've got heavier. You might notice that you've got a bit longer somehow. You might have a kind of pulsy feeling in your extremities, your feet and your hands. You might even feel that your feet and hands feel a bit bigger than they usually do. All of these are indicators that the nervous system is regulating itself in relation to you feeling well, feeling safe, feeling that you belong somewhere, feeling part of a group. All of that, this is a thing that has built a good experience in your life, and you feel it first of all in your nervous system. Now, I'm not going to ask you to do this because I can't work with you if anything happens, but if you were to have an alternative experience, an alternative memory of something that has distressed you or overwhelmed you or really was a traumatizing experience for you, it left you in fear of your life. Now, whether anybody else believes that your life was in danger is irrelevant. If you believe that your life was endangered, then it is a traumatic experience for you. And it doesn't require others to agree with you that it was a life-threatening experience. All they have to do is agree with the fact that that's what you felt. So if you were to have a memory such as that, you might notice that you become tense. You might become dizzy. You might get prickly feelings. You might get clammy. You might get cold. You might get numb. There's all kinds of words that describe how our nervous systems are telling us what's happening. And often we're embarrassed about these words because they're like childish words. They often have ly on the end. Tingly, trembly, shaky, floppy, clammy. So they feel like childish words because as we grow older, we're taught to refine these experiences. So instead of being shaking with rage, we might talk about being frustrated or irritated because it somehow seems to be more age appropriate. But the nervous system doesn't respond to words like frustrated and irritated. They are cortical words. They are conceptual words. When clients ask me or say to me that they feel relaxed, I think, well, I don't know what your relaxation is. My image of relaxation is lying in a jacuzzi in Menorca above the beach all day with my son bringing me lots of gin and tonic. Now that's relaxation for me. Other people's relaxation could be sitting quietly in the back of a church. Other people's relaxation could be sitting in the middle of their families. But what's common to all of us is the physiological experience of softening muscles, loosening joints, widening field of vision, softer jaw, longer breaths, a feeling of flow, a feeling of heaviness. All of these things are to do with relaxation, but the word relaxation means something different to all of us. So the key to resolving trauma is being able to uncouple and separate fear and immobility. So what does that mean? The first thing is, for clients or for the people you work with, when they talk about trauma or when you talk about trauma, is to recognize that every single one of us survived. Now, that's a platitude. That is a platitude. Somebody says victim, somebody says survivor. But a survival strategy, all of us develop a survival strategy. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived. So when a client comes to see me, I want to know from the very, very outset, from day one in the room, I want to know, how did you survive that? That sounds terrible. How did you survive it? And I want to talk to the client about how they survived it so that they can recognize, name, and appreciate their capacity for survival. Because it's on that capacity that we build the rest of the work that we do. If we don't support the client to establish their capacity, then they won't feel safe. And if they don't feel safe, they can't engage with traumatic events. They cannot engage with what happened to them. They will simply repeat the isolation that they experienced in the first moment when the traumatic event occurred. So trauma is something in your life that comes too fast, too big, too overwhelming, threatens the survival of your existence, accompanied by an inability to fight back or get away. And because we can't fight back or get away, it pushes us beyond our normal capacity to cope. And when it pushes us beyond our normal capacity to cope, we have to go into a life-saving experience, which for animals is called play dead, but for human beings is called freeze dissociation. And in freeze dissociation, what we are trying to do is buy time to save our lives. Now, if you can't fight back and can't get away, you might be trapped in a car, you might be a little child, you might be already frightened in the situation, the person may be bigger than you, they may be stronger than you, you may have some moral objection to fighting or hitting or whatever, but some way you can't enact the self-protective mechanisms that are available in your system for fight and flight. So the nervous system gets frozen. We press pause. But when we press pause, the nervous system continues to behave as if the danger is present. Continues to behave as if the danger is present. So we live our lives with this sense of living inside this experience of this terrible event. If you were to put your fingers up in front of your face, about 2 inches from your face, and look through your fingers, you can only see some of the environment, which in your cortex you know is there. It was there a minute ago before you put your hand up. But when you put your hand up, the environment is split up. That's what happens when people are traumatized. They see the world through the experience of the trauma. And as we see the world through the experience of the trauma, the rest of our lives are affected and impacted by that traumatic event. So people develop behaviors that are ways in which we try to modulate, we try to find ways to live better, even though we can't find a way to manage the traumatic experience. Sometimes I describe it to clients like if you take a cross section of a glacier, and the glacier, the bottom of the glacier looks like solid ice, And sometimes we imagine that it's like a blue-green. But on the top of the glacier, there are fissures, there are caves, there are cliffs, there's ravines, there's all sorts of things. So the glacier is like this, but the top of the glacier is like this. But we know that the top of the glacier is like this because the bottom of the glacier is there. And when people are on the top of the glacier, that's the attempt to live your life and to try and rear your children and pay the mortgage and go to work and do all the things you need to do, whilst this is underpinning your life. This is the foundation. This is what's happening. And that experience of living on the top there is what is often referred to as PTSD, although I would call it PTSI. Can't do that with you either. So
Brid, sorry to interrupt. We have about probably 10-15 minutes left.
Lord.
So I don't know if you want to check if there's any more questions or the chat box just to see if anybody has any. Say a lot of them have been answered already. But if you just want to, sorry, as I said, sorry to interrupt.
No, thanks. I'm glad you did. Like, I'm nowhere near done. Okay. How do I get rid of that? Let me get rid of that like that. Okay, so what happens? In our nervous system, we experience charge and discharge all the time. And when I talk about charge, I'm talking about the biochemistry like adrenaline, cortisol, things like this, that allow you to live life normally. So, for example, we have one part of the nervous system, which is the sympathetic nervous system, and that just allows you to move your limbs and move around and do stuff like I've just used my sympathetic nervous system. And my nervous system allows me to experience what I need to do in the world. Now, my parasympathetic system is the system that allows me to rest. And in the course of events, we will normally do something and rest, do something and rest, do something and rest. So we have a charge and a discharge within our normal range of resilience, within the normal range of resilience. So, for example, I have to do this talk. So I get my energy together, I prepare it, I think about it, I put it on the computer. All of this is sympathetic arousal, sympathetic needs, sympathetic movement. And then when it's over, I can relax, have a cup of tea, think about the rest of the day, whatever. And that's my parasympathetic system happening. So that is the normal course of events. But if you imagine that the two sides of the river, they are the edges of your nervous system. And in the normal course of your life, because trauma is a natural experience in life, and we have an inbuilt ability to overcome trauma, because if we didn't, we wouldn't have survived as a species. So it's part of our DNA to be able to overcome trauma, but sometimes something else gets in the way. So if you imagine that, say this is your life, and there are all kinds of impediments in the river, rocks and wood and whatever, but the water finds its way around it, finds its way over it, and continues. But then something specific happens that is experienced as life-threatening. And the extra thing there is that there is no one there to support you, or you cannot see anybody who could support you, or you don't believe anybody could support you, or whatever it happens to be. And you experience this as traumatic. It breaches the riverbank. It breaks and breaches your normal capacity to cope. And in the traumatic response, you spin off in your nervous system into this fight, flight, or freeze experience. And what happens is that we don't realize that exactly the same time that this happens, at exactly the same time that this happens, the capacity to recover and heal and live well is also present in our systems. But because this is so terrifying, we have to keep watching this. We have to keep watching this, you know? We have to keep preparing. We have to keep trying to avoid. We have to keep trying to protect ourselves. And so this gets weak. We forget that it's there. We don't see it so much. We might see it for a second and then hear ourselves say, yes, but. So when in trauma therapy, what we are supporting people to do is to have an embodied experience of their own capacity to feel well. Like when I asked you to bring to mind an event that was pleasant for you. That calls up this part of your brain where you have a sense of yourself as someone who can cope and someone who can live well. And that feeling of coping and living well has been interrupted by this event, has been dominated and overwhelmed by this event. So what we want to do is to support the clients to feel this so that they can re-engage a tiny bit at a time with this experience. And as we do that, the neurological structure that has been orientated, that has been turned towards supporting the fight, flight, or freeze response gets re-employed. It gets re-employed in the service of capacity. So each time we can experience capacity, we can experience ourselves as capable human beings. And from feeling a capable human being, experiencing ourselves as a capable human being, we can engage with this. Then we are redeploying the neurological structures that support trauma, and we redeploy them in the service of capacity. Now, I'll not bother with that. What I would say to you is, this is not a thinking thing. We're not thinking this, or we're not imagining this. We are locating these experiences in our bodies. So if I feel sick in my stomach when I think about something that's happened to me, and I ask a client to see if there is anywhere in their bodies that they feel okay. They might feel strong, or they might feel at ease, or whatever. And we can locate that. We can support and deepen the experience of that capacity as it's held in the body, and work from that to reduce the amount of tension, distress, physical distress held, say, for example, in the abdomen. So we work with tiny little bits that we call titration, and we move between capacity and the edge of trauma, and that allows us to support the client to experience their capacity and reorganize their systems in support of capacity. So to answer the question about the impact of trauma, this is the impact of trauma. In the second that it happens, every part of your body is impacted. Every part. The first thing, of course, that happens with the isolation is the adrenaline and cortisol release. Adrenaline will help you to protect yourself, to lift things, to move, to run fast, to fight, to do the things that you need to do, and the cortisol helps you to manage fear. When you cannot fight back and you cannot get away, adrenaline and cortisol does not go back to its normal levels that's needed for everyday living. It remains at the traumatic level that's needed as a self-protective response. And when this cannot be supported to return to normal levels, then people suffer medical, physiological, and psychological difficulties as they try to manage the overwhelm, as they try to manage this system in their bodies that is overworking in relation to something that happened before but didn't get finished and is appearing again and again and again in their lives, and often in ways that aren't appropriate. You know, often in ways where when people talk about, oh, that's an overreaction. Often a traumatic response can appear like an overreaction, but actually it's the unfinished business of what happened before. So we have to do something to stay alive. And trauma therapists meet people in their trauma room in the aftermath of trauma, not in the event of trauma. The event is over. We're working with people in the aftermath of the event. Anybody in our lives who've been traumatized, we are working with them in the aftermath of the event, unless we also experience the event with them. And there's no guarantee that if I experience a traumatic event or an overwhelming event with another member of my family, for example, I may not be traumatized, but they may be traumatized. And so it's important that we understand how this event happened. What happened to that person? How did they experience? Rather than make a judgment about, I don't know what they're talking about, she's a drama queen, or she wasn't even there, or it was nothing, she's overreacting, whatever. We need to find out what has been triggered by that event for that person. Sorry. Let me go back. So if you imagine again that this is the nervous system, and normally we would have a response, oh, we have to get married, we have to do an exam, we have to go shopping, have to get up in the morning, whatever. But we have the biochemistry to do that and then to relax afterwards. But when a traumatic event happens, that easy flow in the nervous system of action and rest gets distorted. It becomes appropriate in relation to trying to save your life. But when you cannot save your life, it's like when you have your car on and the brake on, and you press the accelerator and the brake at the same time. The car will eventually just do this, and the engine will cut out, and you could ruin your car. That's what the nervous system is like. When there is so much charge in the system to get you to do something to save your life, and you cannot do it, then you get stuck in this experience. And you can fluctuate between the high sympathetic response of, you know, the usual things that we know about, like anxiety, panic, hyperactivity, exaggerated startled, can't relax, restless, emotional flooding, chronic pain, sleeplessness, etc., etc., etc. But if you get stuck in the self-protective mode of play dead, which is also known as dorsal, in this freeze dissociation place here, then you're likely to see depression, flat affect, lethargy, deadness, exhaustion, chronic fatigue, disorientation, disconnection, and so on. Many of the complex syndromes that we experience when we work with clients in this field. So what's successful response? Working between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, between activation and deactivation. It's like a curve. In the first instance, our systems give us a signal through the part of the brain known as the amygdala that there's something wrong. that becomes more intense, and the fight-flight response comes up. So there's a high energy for fight-flight. The adrenaline, the cortisol, all of the ways in which the body organizes to protect itself comes online. Now, if we can do that, if we can save ourselves, if we can get away, then the defensive response becomes completed, and it becomes an exploratory response. So let me just explain that. If I'm coming home at night in a dark street and I hear footsteps behind me, and I move faster and they move faster and I move faster and they move faster, and I've gone from light charge to moderate startle and heading up towards high level, and then somebody tries to steal my handbag. They push me and try to steal my handbag. Now, if I can fight them, if I can get a few digs in, and if I can get home with my handbag intact, and there's somebody in the house that says, "You poor thing, sit down, what'll I get you, what do you want, calm down, you know, I'll phone the police, have a drink," whatever it happens to be, I am in the company of other people who are reinforcing my understanding that I could protect myself, that I was successful in my protection. Then what comes online is the return of natural curiosity. Natural curiosity. The idea that, oh, I can re-engage with the world. I'm not stuck in this isolated place. I can be curious about things. You know, I can be curious about other things. I can take in people. I can take in what's going on. And that is that's the natural resolution for trauma. And sometimes that does happen. And when that happens, we might refer to it as traumatic shock. And it kind of hangs around maybe for a lot of months, but it doesn't become a permanent fixture in our lives. It's only when we cannot complete this, and when we cannot complete this, knowing that other people can see our distress, then we could very well be caught in the continuing physiological experience of trauma, not the cortical remembering of the narrative. The narrative only carries part of what happened. So we need to find safety. And finding safety is a physiological state. It arises from our need for co-regulation to be safe in the group. So we need to find other people who know that we are experiencing this, who are not judging us, who are witnessing our distress, who are giving us support because this is another human being in distress. We are unlikely to suffer the long-term impacts of trauma. So many people in this period of functional immobility, this in the system, the deep in the system immobility, can develop all sorts of conditions. For example, developing any behavior that we can't get through the day without doing, which is an addictive behavior. And it doesn't matter whether that addiction is to running 10 miles a day, that you couldn't get through your day if you didn't do it, to your 15 decades of the rosary, and if you can't get through the day unless you do it, or eating or not eating, or cutting or not cutting. When all of these things become a matter of survival, a matter of getting through that day, then that is an addictive response, and the addiction is not to what's happening, what you're doing. The addiction is to what doing that thing, the ease that it gives you once you've done it, the ease. So in an attempt to try and manage this constant infusion of adrenaline and cortisol, this constant presence of the trauma, we try to find ease. And when we can't resolve this in our systems, we find other things to try and give us that ease, and that's the beginnings of addictions. We can find ourselves with syndromes such as, for example, maybe cluster migraines, irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, cardiovascular disorders, pulmonary disorders, disorders of the viscera, kidney disorders, liver disorders, skin disorders. All these sorts of things can emerge because the system has been compromised. So what we are, I realize I'm going, well, I have to stop here.
In about 2 minutes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Apologies. I'm really sorry because it's something that deserves so much more time. Unfortunately, we have another presentation at 1, unfortunately. So.
Okay. So my apologies, folks. I did tell you I could talk to midnight. So what we're really looking for when we're trying to work with the resolution of trauma is supporting the capacity of the client to find ways to be themselves again in the world in the way that feels good for them. And we do this from supporting the regulation of the nervous system by working with the embodied experience and helping the client to put new language on this newly discovered experience of their capacity that emerges from the work that we do with the body. I will say also that at the heart of trauma and working with trauma is profound grief, because we lose something, and we lose in a way the way we were before the traumatic event happened, and we don't get that back. We never get it back. I remember a woman once saying to me, so my child will, I'm just realizing that my child will never have her first day at school again because of things that had happened on the child's first day at school. She'll never have her first day at school again. No, she won't, because the first day at school is gone. You know, if you've developed irritable bowel syndrome that has really caused terrible damage to your guts, working with capacity and regulation isn't going to repair your bowel, but it will give you an ability to live better in your life, and that can possibly impact and alter the condition that you have. In fact, it will alter the condition that you have, because you are more in contact with your capacity and less orientated to this ongoing danger. And in my practice, I have certainly seen this happen again and again and again. And I'll just finish with this. I decided to do this kind of trauma training, or training and working with trauma, after the IRA ceasefire in 1994. My son had been born in 1993. And with the IRA ceasefire in 1994, someone came on the TV and said, how long will it take for the impacts of this to leave the community? And some well-known person said, probably 5 generations. And I was thinking, that is 5 generations of my family from my infant son on. And I just said, no, not on my watch. And I retrained as a psychotherapist. I was particularly concerned at the lack of support offered to people in the midst of the armed conflict in the north, especially in Catholic areas. There's very little or none. And I wanted to be able to do something that would alter that. And after my first training as a Gestaltist, in my own personal therapy and in my work with my clients, I realized that there was so much that I didn't know, and that no matter how much we told the story, it didn't change things. And it was when I saw Peter Levine work, when I saw him work in Germany. And what stunned me about his work was, first of all, that people did not have to tell the story again and again. You do tell the story, but you tell it in a way that doesn't overwhelm you and doesn't isolate you and leave you locked in the past. That you tell the story in such a supportive way that it can be integrated into the present without shame and self-recrimination. You know, the I shoulda, coulda, woulda, oughta. And if I had my time over again, I would, and I regret all of those things. You can actually do it without the experience of the shame that goes with your inability to protect yourself or your loved ones. So I was astounded because much of the work that I do with people who cannot talk about the conflict for all sorts of reasons, they can't talk about the conflict. So I needed to find another way. And this offered another way for people to be able to engage with the past, to engage with what happened to them as they are currently experiencing it in their lives. And as they experienced it with the unfinished business of the trauma, which is held in the body, but influences and impacts on how we see the world, our ability to move around in the world, and our relationships. So Sinead, thank you very much. I hope the questions that you asked got answered. If they didn't get answered, send me an email.